And welcome, friends. So I want to start out today with mom's stroke brain fog recovery with nutrition support, from herxing to allowing brain treatment. Part 2 is going to be bursa prevention, learning to use just the red and infrared only for deeper targets. Section 3 will be dental wonders experienced, in part from learning to use red and infrared during bursa prevention, and we'll close out with thymus gland stimulation with nutritional support, bacterial flu shaken off rapidly, and we'll discover this concept of organotherapy. So starting with mom's stroke, I want to draw a timeline. My second father, my beloved stepfather Roy, passed away in November of 2023, and pretty soon after, mom gets COVID. So Jim goes out and visits mom in Cali immediately after she comes down with the COVID. She's in pretty bad shape, and as the days progressed, just after January, she started having visual issues, which indicated possible stroke. And unfortunately, an MRI confirmed occipital ischemic stroke, a type of stroke that occurs when a blood vessel supplying the occipital lobe is blocked, causing tissue damage. She spent 5 days in the hospital. She said no to blood thinners, which shocked me. I was very unprepared for that. The doctor said to her with an Eastern European accent, "Oh, you're a feisty one." So she was a feisty one, determined she wasn't going to take synthetic blood thinners. And she was discharged pretty quickly out of the hospital and spent 12 days in a rehab center. That was interesting. We made sure to give her some writing materials. She was still extremely confused. It looked like the early onset of Alzheimer's, which could in part be a lack of blood flow to parts of the brain, in addition, of course, to the amyloids that build up. So after 12 days in the rehab center, she began starting home care. And a couple days into home care, we started seeing this. And anybody who's seen this before, I hope you are connecting this with this COVID-19 issue that she's had. That is the beginning of clots forming in the calves, starting to swell up the ankles. So she calls her MD, concierge MD, expensive guy, calls him up and says, put her on 81 milligrams a day of aspirin. Anything else, doctor? Yeah, have her wear compression stockings. Since she won't take the blood thinners, that's it. This is where we are. Okay, so home health aide starts to give her massages, which is nice, doesn't do anything. The swelling persists, gets pretty bad. You start to see the dark stuff forming on the feet, which is not good because that's localized blood flow being cut off, the very beginnings of a septic condition. And I say, hey, Ma, remember that time I resolved my DVT, deep vein thrombosis, with a natural protocol from that chiropractor I did Skype calls with? Oh, yes, Jimmy. Well, I have some of those enzymes with me. Oh, maybe I can try one. So this is natokinase. Again, do not mix this with synthetic blood thinners. 48 hours later, only 48 hours later, boom. Yeah, so anyhow, not only once did this happen, it happened twice. So what are we talking about with regard to natokinase? It is one of the many enzymes that can be used to break blood clots down. It's a fibrinolytic enzyme. This provides the body with the natural substances to use to break those down, and it worked pretty darn well pretty quickly in 48 hours. She had another episode of the ankle swelling. It was actually more brief. It was about a day, and her swelling completely went away. She forgot that she had taken the natokinase. I had to remind her. She had been Googling natokinase and aspirin and getting very worried because there was all this stuff on Google saying, oh, don't take it with aspirin. So I had to remind her that it already worked. Had to walk her back and settle her down. It's okay. Clots aren't going to break off from this. This is going to help you. And so sometimes Google is not our friend. But twice, natokinase worked wonders. So she resolves. She gets to the point where she can function normally. She's a little dingy, but we have family and home healthcare aides that are watching after her. Jim flies back to Florida February 27th for a much needed break. Being an advocate for someone is actually extremely important. The time in the hospital, I couldn't imagine her not having an advocate, especially for part 2 that's coming up. But it does drain you. If you're not used to that, it's definitely something you want to take a deep breath for. So March 20th, I get the phone call, and sure enough, she fell, hit her head, and found non-responsive by emergency medical technicians. She ended up in the emergency room, and Jim returns to Cali. But this time, I bring a little friend with me. Oh, yeah, and I'm keeping it under my seat, not in the overhead supply, if you get my drift here. So a nice soft bag. I initially was going to go with a hard shell bag for the Firefly, but I went with a soft shell. Much, much, much better. So I go into the hospital. Again, she's under full IVs, and in this case, she's on Keppra, Keppra, which is a drug administered to inhibit the potential of seizures. So it turns out when you're in a trauma care facility and you had a stroke recently, they put you on all this stuff that's what they normally put everybody on just in case. So here she was hallucinating wildly for 2 or 3 days, and I'm starting to flick through my cell phone and I'm looking at side effects. Nurse, can you tell me all the stuff she's on? I'm her advocate. I'm, kind of in charge here. Oh, did you know that Keppra has a side effect of hallucination, and she's basically talking to people over my shoulder and having conversation with people? Oh, okay. Well, what can we do about that? Oh, the doctor's not in till tomorrow. When is the doctor in tomorrow? Oh, between 11 and 4. Could you please call the doctor and tell him that she probably doesn't need this? She's had no signs of any type of seizures. I've never seen her go through a seizure the entire time she's had a stroke. She hit her head. It's probably swollen. Can we get her off this stuff? Oh, we'll talk to the doctor tomorrow. Well, it didn't take about 2 hours, and she did call the doctor. I think they get really worried about this. That's why an advocate is so important. They took her off it right away, and she comes back to her normal senses, completely natural, but still a little dazed from hitting her head, right? So off we go to the rehab center, and it's time to step up with the Firefly. My girlfriend absolutely loves Source 3 on the feet. It makes her sleep deep. And so I talk Mom into letting me do 4 or 5 minutes of Source 3 on her feet. And she says, oh, Jimmy, that heat feels so nice. And this is newbie mistake 1.1. All right. So remember what you're dealing with Source 3. There's a common pathogen, nocardia, very common in people. But I'm doing her feet, which is very interesting. So she wakes up, well, she doesn't sleep all night. I go back home. She doesn't sleep all night. She ends up with a ripping headache. She herxes all night long, and it's mostly in the head. And yet I was doing her feet. So this gets into this mystery. I don't know if we were fully aware of all of the components of light. Some have called it quantum source. I think there's some aspects to this that we're still going to discover as we work our way down the road. And in this case, move my head out the way just a little bit. It's talking about platelets being dynamic sensors and effector cells during infectious diseases. Activated platelets can directly sequester or kill pathogens or facilitate pathogen clearance. There are many gaps in our understanding of the role platelets play in infectious diseases. Okay, so they admit in 2019, we don't know everything what's going on with platelets, but these are traveling through the blood system. So they're a direct part of this reaction. Just wanted to bring this up for everyone who is into the scientific side of things, just to think about. Because Maurice had talked about using the Firefly in the veins, basically starting to circulate it in the blood. The blood transference might actually be one of the reasons behind the non-locality of the treatments. You treat one area, it affects somewhere else. In this case, feet, and she herxed all night long. It was so sad when I got there. I just felt like about 2 inches tall. How to regain trust. I mean, that's where you're at in this situation. How do you regain trust? So we roll back into home care, and just after we got to home care, we finally had the neurologist visit where she was able to meet the neurologist. Figured this is, 3 months after the original issue. That's a long time to wait for a neurologist to see you, isn't it? Yeah, it's kind of normal with the system these days. So this is a top-down cutaway of the brain. You can see a little bit of the infarction back here. And now we're just going to lower our way through the brain as we go through into the bottom side of the occipital ridge, which is right here. And you can see they're little localized infarctions, and it's dead tissue, unfortunately, at this point. I had the neurologist very carefully show me exactly where these areas were on Mom's head. Then I called Dr. Martin, and Dr. Martin kindly called me back with Maurice. So that was quite nice to speak to both of the originators of the lovely instrument to walk me through how I'm going to earn back trust. And their immediate advice was just use source 1. There's no reason to use any of the frequencies. Just do source 1, go very gently, very slow, low intensity, small amount of time. Great. So I thought, yeah, that's what you told us when we first bought the instrument with Lindsay on the phone. And all we get excited by stuff, and we think like the medical system sometimes. Or I need a lot of power. I've got to powerfully build her back. I know for a fact the Source 3 did work. So anytime you get a herx out of somebody, it is actually doing something. That's your evidence that things are happening. So I was walking in jugs of absolutely fresh, pure orange juice to her to make sure she was getting vitamin C complex, not ascorbic acid. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I wanted her to get vitamin C so she could flush out all the stuff that was in her, and vitamin C will do that. So how do you gain trust? That's the question. So we're sitting watching TV, which I never do at home, but I'm with her, so I'm watching TV with her. And I started to self-administer Source 3 on my head. 10-minute sessions. And she'd look over and she'd go, Jimmy, aren't you overdoing that? No, feels great. Feels great. I do a couple times. I love Source 3 is amazing. Anyway, so I kept this up for a few days just to show, I'm cognitively there. I'm not falling over. I'm okay. It's a demonstration of faith, right? Then Mom stubs her toe. And then this is where the Spirit came in and said, let me help you out with this one. Let me help you out. Hey, Jimmy, maybe that machine of yours can help with my swollen toe. It very quickly resolved that little swollen toe, I'll tell you what. And I was very darn sure to make sure not to use any of the other sources. It was source 1 on toe. Toe came back to health, and that was the gateway into the head session. Finally able to do what I planned on doing. And then we were talking about a week or so, maybe a week and a half, something in there, 2 weeks maybe even, until I was able to do that. You can't force stuff on people. In fact, sometimes the most attractive thing is to actually pull back a little bit, right? So this is all the psychology that doctors know, but they're not taught really. They figure it out on the way. But when you understand the human personality, you understand how important suggestion is. And suggestion is the principle of nonverbal communication where cues are given and offered and ideas are given through gestures, voice of authority, words, images, and people respond. So this was a great lesson in waiting for the time to organically appear where she would then begin to retry her trust in the machine. So we started out with 111. Just absolutely low key. I was just so excited that she was even letting me get it. And I'm hitting all the areas, by the way, the doctor had recommended in terms of where the infarctions were. And I'm doing general cranial stuff as we get through this. So I'm able to raise up the timer a little bit, keep the intensity at 1, keeping the communication with her very open and truthful, what intensity we're at, how long we're doing it. And so you want to gain that cooperation. You have to have agreement with people you're working with. You can never force things on them. That's one of the errors doctors make. They try to authoritize over someone's agreement, and that you break the oneness. The oneness is gone when you do that. So you have to actually be in agreement with people. Worked it up to intensity 2, went for 5 minutes, worked it up to intensity 3, intensity 4, working mostly the occipital, but other areas as well. And I'm sneaking in, about a week and a half into this, I'm sneaking in a little bit of 2 and a little bit of 3 for 1 minute at a time. Just real small. I know the amyloids are something that builds up with the COVID, so I wanted to get some 3 in there. 2, obviously, it's bacterial, and there's enough in all of us at any moment in time that's helpful. So I was able to just pepper these in, not too long, but enough that she wasn't herxing. She was getting acclimated to the light. And finally, God help us, we were able to get to 10 minutes on the cranium. We had a very small amount of intensity at first, and we built that up. And that was over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks. It was probably closer to 3 weeks. So we got a nice full treatment on Mom. Duration of elapsed time to the onset of the stroke to the light sessions meant realistic expectations were not to expect visual and balance impairment to be resolved. She wasn't going to come and snap out of where she was, right? So the brain fog and what looked like early Alzheimer's was indeed resolved with time. Daily function came back to normal, and duration of concentration continued to improve over many months. She was able to do her bills. She was able to write her checks. She was able to function like a real human being. I'm sitting there shaking my head going, oh boy, oh boy. This is what it's supposed to do. It did what it was supposed to do. It absolutely did what it was supposed to do. And a greeting card at the U.S. Post Office clearly showed what it was like to go through this 4-month situation. I had to take a cell phone pic of it, and there it is. Absolutely perfect. That's what it felt like.